Who among us hasn't at least once dreamed of hitting the jackpot? We often imagine that with enough money, all our life's troubles would simply vanish. We could buy anything we wanted, forget about work, and live like royalty. But history tells a much darker tale. Wealth that arrives too quickly, not earned through hard work or real skill, isn't always a blessing. Sometimes it acts more like a silent virus, slowly destroying everything from the inside out. And this, my friends, is exactly the story of the Spanish Empire. Before its fateful encounter with immense riches, Spain was already a formidable power. Yet, it wasn't an economic colossus. Spanish society had just emerged from the Reconquista, a centuries-long struggle to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula. They were strong with swords, yes, but weak in manufacturing and trade. It was a deeply religious society, hardened by constant warfare, where a shining blade was always prized more than a dusty ledger. Then, in the 16th century, Spain didn't just win the lottery, they stumbled upon a colossal treasure chest, the biggest source of silver the world had ever known. In a surprisingly short time, Spain rose to become a global superpower. They were the very first empire where the sun literally never set. They boasted the mightiest army, the most terrifying navy, and truly believed that God himself was watching their backs. But here's the kicker. That very wealth laid the groundwork for an inevitable collapse. Spain was about to learn one of economics' most brutal lessons. Easy money, wealth that isn't truly earned, is a dangerous illusion. It's like an addictive drug, offering a short burst of euphoria before leaving behind a trail of long-term devastation. And Spain was speeding towards a massive overdose. To understand where this tragedy began, we need to rewind the clock. Way back to a windswept, freezing plateau nestled high in what is now the Bolivian Andes. Back then, it was firmly under Spanish control. The year was 1545. The place was called Potosi. The destiny of an entire empire pivoted on one accidental moment. A local indigenous man, Diego Hualpa, was chasing a stray llama up the mountainside when he slipped. Losing his balance, he instinctively grabbed a bush. As the roots tore from the earth, what he saw changed history forever. Veins of pure, glittering silver shone brightly from deep within the mountain. Diego Hualpa had accidentally discovered Cerro Rico, the rich hill. This was a geological marvel, almost beyond belief. It wasn't just a silver mine, the entire mountain seemed to be made of solid silver ore. When the Spanish conquistadors finally set foot in this place, they could barely believe their eyes. It was exactly like El Dorado, the mythical land of gold they had been searching for all along. They immediately plunged into its exploitation. Potosi quickly transformed from a remote, desolate highland into one of the largest cities in the world at the time. In just a few short decades, its population surpassed even London and Paris. It was a city built on violence and an insatiable thirst for wealth, generating riches beyond anyone's wildest dreams. This city sat at an astonishing altitude of over 4,000 meters above sea level, where the air was so thin that simply walking down the street left people gasping. But to pull silver out of the mountain, Spain needed something even more crucial: labor. And this is where the economic miracle began, tragically hand in hand with a human nightmare. The Spanish imposed the Mita system, a brutal form of forced labor on the indigenous people. Tens of thousands of men were herded into dark, suffocating tunnels deep within the mountain. They toiled for days on end, never seeing the sunlight, carrying heavy sacks of ore, climbing rotten ladders where a single misstep could mean instant death. People whispered that if you squeezed a Spanish silver coin, blood would seep from it. This mountain became a symbol of obsession and terror for the local population. But digging the silver ore out of the ground was only half the battle. The problem was that the silver ore in Potosi wasn't particularly high grade. To extract pure silver from that mountain of rubble, the Spanish were forced to adopt a completely new industrial technology for its time: the Mercury amalgamation process. They crushed the ore, mixed it with highly toxic mercury, then forced people to stomp on the mixture directly with their bare feet to ensure it blended thoroughly. This wasn't just a regular production process, it was a chemical revolution. This very method unlocked the ability to extract silver on an industrial scale, a scale never before seen in human history. The sheer volume of silver pouring out was so staggering it stunned the entire world. Between 1550 and 1800, Spain's American colonies, especially Mexico and Peru, became the two largest silver mining centers globally. Many estimates suggest that during this period, most of the world's silver was unearthed here, and a massive portion flowed directly to Spain. This silver was melted into bars and minted into the famous piece of 8 coin. This coin is considered one of the earliest international currencies, much like the US dollar's role today. It was widely accepted everywhere, from the bustling markets of Shanghai to Seville, from Boston to Bombay. Twice a year, the treasure fleets, also known as the Flota de Indias, would gather in Havana, ready to carry this colossal fortune across the ocean back to Europe. These were massive convoys of heavily armed galleons, their hulls sinking deep into the water under the weight of riches that, if converted to today's money, would amount to billions of dollars. Whenever these sails appeared off the coast of Spain, church bells across the country would ring in unison. The king would breathe a sigh of relief while bankers rubbed their hands together in satisfaction. The empire's lavish party could last another year. In the blink of an eye, Spain rocketed to become Europe's reigning superpower. They commanded the infamous tercios infantry, military units that were virtually unbeaten on any battlefield. Grand, opulent churches, gilded in gold, sprang up everywhere, symbols of both power and faith. At this time, the King of Spain, Charles V, and later his son, Philip II, wielded supreme power as if they ruled the entire world. They truly believed that God had chosen Spain to lead humanity, but it was precisely this belief that led them to a fatal miscalculation. They looked at the mountains of silver piling up and told themselves they were rich. They failed to realize that at that very moment, the seeds of their decline were being sown. They confused mere money with true wealth. Money is just a medium of exchange. Real wealth is the ability to produce goods and services, from food and clothing to tools and ships. But let's be clear, silver doesn't automatically kill a nation. Plenty of countries possess natural resources and remain prosperous and stable. The problem was that silver amplified Spain's existing weaknesses, from its state administration and consumption habits to its chronic underinvestment in production. Resources aren't a death sentence, they're a test. And Spain sadly failed that test. So Spain found what seemed like an endless supply of cash, then gradually traded its real productive capacity for a sense of short-term security. The silver by this point was acting exactly like an addictive drug. It created a powerful high, an illusion that the empire was invincible. Yet, deep within the economy, its most vital organs were quietly going numb. Farmers abandoned their fields, blacksmiths put down their hammers. The fundamental productive foundations of society were slowly neglected, as if they were no longer necessary. Because why work, right? When ships laden with silver kept arriving faithfully year after year. The addiction had truly begun. Imagine for a moment you're a shoemaker living in Seville around 1550. Seville was then the gateway to the Americas, the most vibrant and exploding city in the world. Then suddenly those ships appear. They dock, sailors pour onto the quays, their pockets heavy with silver. Nobles had money, soldiers had money, everyone was ready to spend, and everyone wanted to buy your shoes. So, in that situation, what would you do? You'd do what any sensible business person would do. You raise your prices. Now, imagine this isn't just happening to you, but to everyone, everywhere, all at once. The baker raises the price of bread. Landlords increase rent. Weavers charge more for cloth. Everything simultaneously becomes more expensive. This is precisely the phenomenon that economic historians call the price revolution. It was the first large-scale inflationary crisis in modern history. As tons of silver flooded into Spain, the money supply skyrocketed, but the actual quantity of goods, the number of shoes or loaves of bread produced, remained largely unchanged. For many centuries before this, prices in Europe had been relatively stable. A loaf of bread in 1500 cost almost the same as in 1400. But when silver deluged the Spanish economy, prices soared. At one point, increases were recorded in the hundreds of percent, with some estimates approaching 400%. In our modern economy, we're used to inflation rates of 2 or 3% per year. But in the 16th century, such a shock was a real disaster. It shattered the entire social order, and the poor were always the first to be crushed under the wheels of inflation. Wages simply couldn't keep up with rising prices. A Spanish farmer gradually realized that even though the country was now flooded with more silver than ever before, he could buy less food than his own grandfather. Famine returned to rural areas, not because of a lack of food, but because money could no longer perform its basic function. But while the poor struggled to survive, the wealthy faced a different paradox. A paradox that would ultimately destroy Spain's industrial base. Because inflation drove costs sky high, everything produced in Spain gradually became incredibly expensive. Domestic goods lost their competitive edge. Let's go back to our shoemaker. His pair of shoes now cost 10 silver coins because he had to pay so much for leather and food. Meanwhile, a shoemaker in France or England, where silver hadn't yet inundated the economy, could still make a similar pair of shoes for, say, 2 silver coins. So, what would Spanish consumers do? They stopped buying domestically produced shoes. Instead, they switched to buying imported shoes from France. Spain gradually became a funnel, where silver flowed in and then almost immediately flowed right back out again. In modern economics, this distortion is called the resource curse, or more broadly, the phenomenon of an economy becoming warped when easy money floods in. The currency strengthens, prices escalate, domestic production shrinks, while imports swell. On the surface, it looks wealthy, but underneath, the economy is slowly losing its strength. And true to this mechanism, silver would arrive in Seville unloaded by the ton. But after just a few short weeks, that silver would leave Spain, flowing to France, England, Holland, and Italy to pay for imported goods. Spain did all the heavy, dangerous work. They enslaved miners, crossed stormy oceans, battled pirates. But in the end, most of that money fell into the hands of their rivals, just to pay for meals and consumer goods. A famous saying of the time emerged, "Spain is the mouth that receives food and chews it for the rest of Europe." A Frenchman even sarcastically remarked that in Spain, the only thing that was cheap was silver itself. This economic reality not only depleted money, but also gradually changed the country's entire culture. In England and the Netherlands, a powerful merchant class was on the rise. They built factories, shipyards, and textile mills to produce goods to sell to the increasingly rich Spaniards. But ironically, right there in Spain, working for a living was gradually seen as beneath you. The ideal social figure in Spain at the time wasn't a merchant or a producer, but a Hidalgo, literally, the son of a something. Hidalgos were minor nobles who owned land, didn't engage in manual labor, and lived off state subsidies or rental income. Status mattered more than skill. Birth was valued more than the value you created. The flood of easy money gradually shaped a society of consumers and bureaucracy. The dream for many was no longer to start a business or innovate, but to secure a position in the government. The closer to the silver flow, the better. When rewards come from privilege rather than creativity, society naturally chooses the path of least resistance. Behind this cultural story lay an institutional structure that was incredibly difficult to reform. The burden of taxation weighed heavily on productive regions like Castile, while many privileged classes contributed very little. The more money the crown needed for wars, the more it raised taxes, sold offices, and even sold noble titles. In such an environment, skilled individuals lost the motivation to engage in business or production because their profits could be siphoned away at any moment. When the rules of the game are designed this way, society automatically chooses the safest path, clinging to privilege, relying on the state, instead of embracing innovation and productivity. Spanish literature of this period, like Don Quixote or the picaresque novels, vividly reflects this spirit. The pages are filled with images of impoverished nobles on the verge of starvation, yet resolutely refusing to work because labor was considered lowly and shameful. They'd rather polish their old armor and pretend to be rich than dirty their hands with trade or manufacturing. While the Dutch were inventing stock markets and the English were diligently improving agriculture, Spain? poured its energy into building churches and buying lavish velvet cloaks. On the surface, it looked glorious, but internally the country was slowly becoming hollow. The economy appeared to glitter with gold on the outside, adorned with spoils from the Americas. But behind that glamorous facade, everything was silently rotting. There was no production, no innovation. All that remained was waiting for the next treasure fleet. This almost absolute dependence on those silver-laden ships created a deadly vulnerability. The entire stability of the empire now hinged on wooden vessels having to cross a vast ocean, full of storms and enemies. If the wind didn't blow, or if a fleet simply didn't return, the king could suddenly find himself without money to spend. And at the heart of this fragile system was King Philip II, a man consumed by an enormous thirst for power. He didn't just want to be rich, he wanted to dominate the entire world. He was even willing to spend that silver before it ever reached his shores. At the time, Philip II was considered the most powerful man on earth, but that power rested on an incredibly shaky foundation. He sat in his massive, somber palace El Escorial, surrounded by monks and towering piles of paperwork. From there, he ruled Spain, Portugal, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, the Philippines, and the entirety of the Americas. His authority stretched across continents. He was truly a planetary king, but holding the whole world came at an incredibly steep price. Philip II saw himself not just as an earthly monarch, but as God's sword, chosen to execute divine will. He believed it was his sacred mission to defend Catholicism against the surging tide of Protestant Reformation sweeping across Europe, and simultaneously to confront the expanding Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. This meant he had to fight almost everyone, everywhere for many unending years. And these wars, fueled by faith and ego, were never cheap. Philip II plunged into a confrontation with the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, culminating in the colossal naval battle of Lepanto. He also constantly fought with France for control of Italy, but his most protracted and dangerous bleeding wound was in the Netherlands. The Netherlands at the time was a territory under Spanish control, but also the birthplace of burgeoning capitalism and Protestantism. When the Dutch revolted, Philip II responded with overwhelming force. He dispatched the fearsome army of Flanders to crush the rebellion, thus igniting the 80 Years' War, a drawn-out nightmare of logistics. To get soldiers to the Netherlands, Spain had to march them along the Spanish road from Italy, across the Alps, and deep into northern Europe. They had to pay, feed, and equip some 70,000 soldiers, thousands of kilometers from home for decades on end. But with its domestic industry eroded by inflation, Spain couldn't even produce enough weapons for its own army. Many times Spain was forced to buy gunpowder and cannons from foreign merchants, sometimes even from the Dutch themselves, who were on the other side of the war. Silver from Potosi was quite literally funding Spain's enemies. And then a new obsession gradually emerged: England. In Philip II's eyes, Queen Elizabeth IV of England was a Protestant heretic, a direct threat to the divinely ordained order he believed in. Not only that, but her privateers, men like Francis Drake, relentlessly hunted and plundered Spain's treasure fleets. By 1588, Philip II decided to gamble everything. He ordered the deployment of the Spanish Armada. This was the most expensive naval force ever assembled in human history up to that point. 130 warships, 30,000 men, and thousands of cannons. The cost of this campaign was colossal, far exceeding normal financial limits. To pay for this massive gamble, Philip II didn't use the silver he already had. He used the silver he hoped to have in the future, and it was here that the dark side of Spain's financial system was revealed. The loans called Asientos. Asientos were short-term loans with very high interest rates, provided by powerful banking families and financial magnates from Germany and Genoa, such as the Fuggers or the Welsers. In essence, Philip II was taking cash advances on future income, not for an individual, but for an entire empire. He would approach these bankers and say, "Lend me 5 million ducats right now to build my fleet. When the treasure fleet arrives in 6 months, I'll pay you back in full." Seeing the prospect of future treasure fleets laden with silver and gold, the bankers agreed. They applied interest rates of 10%, 20%, sometimes even as high as 40%. But then disaster struck. The Armada was not defeated by a stronger navy. It was beaten by brutal weather, sheer bad luck, and rigid tactics. Fierce storms smashed the Spanish fleet against the rocks of Scotland and Ireland. Nearly half the ships sank. Thousands of sailors perished at sea. When the grim news reached the court, it said Philip II exclaimed, "I sent my ships to fight men, not God's winds and waves." But to the bankers, God's winds were of no concern. Their only concern was their money. The ships lay at the bottom of the ocean. The cannons were rusting in the salt water. The entire investment had vanished with the waves. But the debts remained, and interest continued to pile up every single day. The resource curse had now morphed, evolving into an inescapable debt trap. By the 1570s, the interest payments alone on the national debt exceeded the Spanish Empire's entire tax revenue. Just imagining that figure is enough to grasp the severity of the catastrophe. Every single coin the government collected from taxes, plus every silver shipment arriving from the Americas, wasn't even enough to cover the interest payments. The principal debt remained completely untouched. It was all just a desperate attempt to stave off immediate collapse. The king was trapped on a treadmill, running faster and faster but unable to stop. To survive, he was forced to borrow new money just to pay off old debts. Spain's future was gradually being mortgaged for generations to come. The king sold even the right to collect taxes, which is a fundamental pillar of a nation's sovereignty. He sold noble titles. He squeezed the peasant class until they had nothing left to lose. In reality, control of the Spanish Empire gradually fell into the hands of the Genoese bankers, even though the king nominally remained in charge. Gold and silver arrived in Seville, were unloaded, and then almost immediately transferred straight into the ledgers of Italian banks. Spain, at this point, was nothing more than a shipping company for its creditors, and the entire system was stretched to its breaking point. Just one bad year, one storm sinking an entire fleet, or a pirate raid, and this house of cards could completely collapse. Today, we often think of a country defaulting on its debts, national bankruptcy, as a modern phenomenon. People talk about Greece, Argentina, or Venezuela, but in fact, Philip II of Spain was one of the first to turn national bankruptcy into a political tool. The breaking point arrived in 1557 when the treasury had been depleted by war and imperial spending. The flow of silver might slow down by just one beat, but debt obligations never did. The treasure fleet was only slightly delayed, but that was enough. The bankers immediately closed their purses, refusing to lend another penny. Philip II stood before his court and issued a royal decree. He declared that Spain was suspending all payments to its creditors. In essence, he looked the most powerful financiers in Europe straight in the eye and said, "I won't pay." It was a true financial earthquake that rocked the entire continent. In Antwerp and Genoa, banks collapsed overnight. Families who had been among the wealthiest lost everything. Europe's entire credit market was paralyzed. This was the 16th century version of the 2008 financial crisis, but triggered by the decision of a single man. The tragedy was that this shock didn't stop Spain's spending. On the contrary, everything just became more expensive. Spain was addicted to war and addicted to imports. They had no other option but to keep borrowing. After each default, the bankers eventually came back because the silver flow was still there. But this time, they imposed much higher interest rates to compensate for the risk. The debt spiral began to accelerate uncontrollably. Spain defaulted again in 1575, then repeated the pattern in 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647. It became a generational loop. Borrow, spend, collapse, then borrow again, spend again, collapse again. The consequences for the Spanish people were absolutely devastating. When the king couldn't pay his soldiers, mutinies began, and social order gradually disintegrated. In 1576, unpaid Spanish soldiers stormed and sacked the city of Antwerp, burning it down in a rampage history remembers as the Spanish Fury. This act destroyed the financial heart of Northern Europe and pushed the Dutch to an even more ironclad determination in their fight for independence. Back home, the Spanish government faced a stark reality and was forced to resort to a new, desperate measure. Because most of the silver had flowed out of the country, ending up in the hands of foreign bankers, there was almost not enough money left inside Spain for everyday transactions. Facing this predicament, the crown chose the most dangerous path, debasing the currency itself. They stopped minting silver coins for the public and switched to minting coins made entirely of copper called vellon. This was a type of currency with no real intrinsic value. It was a kind of token money created simply to patch up short-term shortages. The king had billions of these copper coins minted and forced the populace to accept them at the same value as silver coins. In reality, this was a form of hidden tax, where the state shifted the financial burden onto the shoulders of its citizens without having to issue any direct tax decrees. The predictable result was superinflation, piling on top of the inflation wave already caused by the silver. Prices fluctuated wildly, losing all sense of direction. People began hoarding silver, hiding it away, and refusing to accept the copper coins. The economy gradually split in two. The wealthy and the government transacted with each other using silver, while the poor were forced to buy and sell using almost worthless copper coins. The middle class was crushed and disappeared completely. By the mid-17th century, Spain's golden age had officially ended. The silver mines in Potosi were gradually depleted. The ore veins grew thinner and thinner. But the bigger problem wasn't in the ground, it was in Spain itself. For hundreds of years, they had grown accustomed to using money to buy everything instead of learning how to create things themselves. When the flow of silver began to dwindle, they realized they had no foundation left to rely on. They hadn't built a strong wool industry like England, they hadn't established a modern banking system like the Dutch, and they hadn't developed sophisticated luxury goods manufacturing like France. Cities in Castile, once bustling with trade and craftsmanship, gradually became deserted. The population declined and fields lay abandoned. Spain sank into a long, dark slumber of poverty and backwardness that lasted for generations. The empire that once owned the world was now bitterly nicknamed the sick man of Europe. Meanwhile, the nations that had siphoned off Spain's silver, like England and the Netherlands, followed a completely different path. They used that capital to invest, build commercial fleets, fund scientific research, and establish stock exchanges. Ultimately, they understood a core truth of economics. Real wealth isn't in metals dug from the earth, but in human productivity and creative capacity. The Dutch used Spain's own silver to build the ships that would dominate global trade. The English also used that silver to finance the Industrial Revolution, laying the foundations for their modern economic might. In the end, Spain merely played the role of a conduit, a funnel through which wealth from the Americas flowed to help build the modern world, while they themselves were drained and hollowed out from within. The story of the Spanish Empire stands as the ultimate warning for any nation or individual. It is the chilling tale of the resource curse. Whether it was silver in 1550 or oil in the modern era, easy money often breaks the fundamental link between labor and reward. It creates an illusion of prosperity, but underneath, a silent decay gnaws at the foundations. Spain drowned in silver. They thought they controlled their destiny, but in the end, they were controlled by their very own good fortune. Money can buy goods, yes, but it cannot buy productive capacity. And when that capacity vanishes, no matter how rich you seem, your wealth is just paper.